Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, in today's episode, we actually begin the modelling process for one of the buildings, at least, to get us started. And of course, it is that small outbuilding, which I believe was the coals and lamps room. So yes, the coals and lamps room is going to be the first building that I'm going to experiment with and actually gauge how the assembly is going to work, of course, for this building and of course the other two structures. That's the Platform 2 building and also the main station building. So if we take a look at the mock-up that I did several weeks ago, and of course we can see that it's quite a simple structure. There's not a lot of complex detail to this. It's a simple roof line. It's basically a rectangle. So it's a good place to start, I think, for our first completed model structure. So the building consists of two rooms, which I believe one would have been a coals room and the other would have been a lamps room. Now, of course, as this building currently stands on Law and Guild's property, of course, it's no longer a coals room and a lamps room. One of the rooms appears to have been converted into a bathroom of sorts, so there's a toilet and it looks like there may be a shower basin there as well, and I do believe also a window has been added to the back wall. I'm not quite sure if there would have been windows in either of the rooms. There might have been a vent, but I'm not sure about windows. So of course the idea in today's episode is to model this building, of course without all the ivy and overgrowth that's on it, and in a more pristine condition, so what it might have looked like, say, back in the early 1900s. So I think without further ado, let's just jump into what I got up to. So based on that mock-up that we just had a look at, it was a case of developing the template a little bit further and of course reconfiguring it to suit laser cutting. So that involves including some notches so that certain components and wall sections can slot together, and each of these, of course, notches and so forth offers themselves up as a guide that locks it all into place. So we have all the components here, and of course this has all just been laser cut out of some 3mm MDF. Now the interesting thing is I really honestly don't know the thickness of the walls, but there is actually some internal walls in the station building which approximately are about 3mm in thickness in terms of that scale thickness. So that's what I'm using, because the outer walls of the station building are a lot thicker. They're actually really quite deep, the station external walls of the station building, but I can't imagine this outbuilding or the coals and lamps room, I'm not sure whether they would have built the walls as thick as that. So I'm going on this being, and also I guess keeping it simple, a 3mm MDF. We've got a 2mm card base here as well, and the only reason I'm doing this card base is just simply it keeps everything true and square. So in this situation, because we're going down this process of wrapping brick around a built structure, I really don't need to apply any brickwork or do anything first for this particular structure itself. I can apply all the brickwork after all of this is all assembled. So we're just using PVA glue for this. This would be, well, I think there's probably the most sensible glue to use, being MDF for a timber based product. So I think the process will be is we're going to slot these in. So this is our middle section. We're just going to run some glue along here. Right, so I've just popped some rubber bands around it. I think that's probably really the easiest way of actually clamping this all together, and I think I might actually pop some around this other part as well. Right, so that's the main structure assembled, and it's pretty quick and simple, being a nice simple building, obviously. Right, so that's all assembled and bound up with some rubber bands to hold it all together, and we'll just set that aside now because I'm also looking at some of the other features. So we've got the gable ends, like the fascia boards at the end, and then we've got some doors, and I've got some tiny microscopic thin door frames here. Now I've painted up those. I've got to paint up these gable ends, but of course one of the things I had to really investigate, which I hadn't done so far, of course, is colours. Now there is so much involved in it that I'm actually making it a separate video because if I got into it now, we'd be here forever. So the colours, or the paint that I'm using for these particular models, I'm going to use the Life Colour paints. Now this is an Italian brand of model paint, and of course they're readily available at my local model shop, and I actually quite like them. They're very good. They're relatively inexpensive. They're a bit cheaper than the likes of Humbrol and Tamiya, and they have a pretty good range. There's quite a lot of different tones. So this colour here, for example, is going to be one of these colours in here, and it's probably a bit hard to pick out really what's going on in here, but these are predominantly, well, at least the first three columns are GWR, experimentation, and this is Barry Railway at the end here. So in terms of the colour for the trim on this outbuilding, of course the doors, the door frames and the gable ends, I'm looking at these two colours down here, which I think are kind of possibly closer to what Barry Railway colours might be. So it's a little bit richer than, for example, in here the browns that would have been potentially GWR. So as I said, I'll get into this colour mapping that I've done here in another episode because it's really complex how I arrived at these colours and all of that type of thing. Quite a tricky exercise. So what I'm actually just going to do now is just finish off with painting up these gable ends, and then I guess the next stage really is, once this is dry, which is probably not far off, we'll actually begin the wrapping process with the brick printed texture. Right, so the main structure is pretty much dry now, and it's quite simple and very sturdy, but it's a good basis now for applying the brick texture. So we've got our texture here. Now this has been designed up on the computer with the bricks and the stonework as well, so everything's all printed in one go, so the stonework's not something I'm applying separately over the top, and it's a case of actually working out exactly where this is going to go in relation to the laser cut file. So as long as the two correspond with each other, there shouldn't be any issues. So you can see here we've got one large length here and then a shorter length here. So the shorter length is for the back wall, so that's running along there, and then this length here is for the front and the two sides. So the plan is I'm going to apply the brickwork to the back wall and trim that, and then the brickwork to the front and the sides goes on afterwards, and the idea is that this stonework here is going to wrap around the back corners of the building, and this is where the join or overlap will be, and of course it will be disguised by this stonework on the corners. So in terms of the stonework itself, what I've actually done is, originally I sort of thought of using the stonework that Gil and Laura had photographed and sent through to me, but The only issue with that is that you sort of run into problems with when it goes around a corner, the stonework, the pattern stays the same kind of within the stone and as it wraps around the corner. So what I've done is I've found a large texture of kind of like a sandstone type colour and texture, and that is actually used and contained within these stone block shapes. And literally I'm using the same texture and I just move it around inside the frame of this block shape in order to get different tones and different colours of stonework. And then when it comes to wrapping around the corner, the stone wraps around the corner and it looks like it's part of the same stone and not like a separate stone. So that's the whole point behind it. Now the brickwork though, that is the brickwork from Laura and Gil's photography. So I think Gil took some photos of a nice large area of brickwork, and basically what I've done is repeated that and tried to limit the repetitive pattern that you get when you start tiling a section of brickwork. It's still there to a degree, but I've tried to limit as best as I can. So as I said, this is printed on label paper and been sprayed over with a clear matte varnish, so that avoids the print from getting scratched as I'm applying it to this wee structure. So we're going to start with the back wall first and slot that into place, and as you can see what we've got is we've got some wee black lines here. Now these indicate where doors and corners of the building are, so the theory is that I'm going to trim these where these sections are or these black lines are, and that is my way of lining up this brickwork onto the building. So we'll just do this back section first, so we'll get that out of the way. Now there's two little wee small stone blocks here. That is actually for the doorstep, so they are going to be separate pieces that are going to get applied later. And what do we want to do? I think we're going to trim this to the end of those black lines. And I'm going to trim up to the edge of that black line in there and in there, and then trim that section out, just the white piece. So we now know that the edge of the wall or the corners are there and there, and I think we'll just cut off some of this excess and chop off that bit of excess, and let's just see how we go. So the idea is that I'm going to apply this over here, and where those white tabs are coming down here, that's where I've got to line up the two corners of the building. Now it doesn't need to be absolutely bang on accurate, but I think these are just so small, these sticky textures, that I think we'll just peel the entire backing off and go for gold. So the main thing is I'm lining up to the bottom. These bricks have got to line up to the bottom edge of that. So we should be lined up, so you can see there out, we've got it lined up to the corners and lined up to that bottom edge, and then we can start applying a bit of pressure on this. And as you can see, I've got a lot of excess on this. This is the size of the brick pattern I've made up, which is kind of made up of about 4 of the original photograph and sort of photoshopped together. So we're just going to Give this a good solid press down. Right, so that's applied. So what we can do now is run our knife down and trim off this excess. Right, so that's one wall covered in some brickwork, and I'll say that was the easy part because there's no windows, there's no nothing in there. Now interestingly, actually, while I'm on the subject of windows, there is a window in this room here. I'm not sure about the other room, but I suspect that possibly it was an addition to the Coals and Lamps room, because the window from Laura and Gill's footage, it doesn't really look like it's of the same kind of architecture as the original building, and suspect it's possibly been added in there because there's no stonework around the window frame. It's just, it looks like the bricks have just been cut out and the window's been shoved in there. So I'm not including a window in the version on my layout. This is just going to be a solid brick wall across the back. But let's get on to the front and sides, and this is going to be a little bit more difficult with the wrap because we're going to do this in one piece. We don't need all of that, and do want to trim off the excess here. That's a door, these are door, and these are the corners, so I want to trim a section down from there and from that line, and then trim across, because this is going to be where I'm going to line up with the structure. So take that piece out. Now the other thing that we are going to do is at this end here, we're going to trim this right back to the stonework, and then we're actually going to trim these out. So I've trimmed off the stonework down here at the end. So this is the end that's going to actually be wrapping around and onto the back of here. So theoretically that is going to be wrapping around there, and all I want is the stonework to wrap around and not the brickwork. So we'll do the same at the other end, and if this method works and it looks okay, then of course I'll use this for all the other buildings. So in a way, this method that I'm sort of having a go at here is a little bit of a trial run to see how it looks. And what I am going to do, because we've got a print but it is white stock or white label paper, that we might actually see a bit of a white edge there. So I've got a marker pen here, and although this might seem ridiculous, I was going to run a marker pen along the edges of these. And of course I'm holding the pen away from the print on the back edge of the paper, so that if I slip, it's going to go down the back of this print, not down the front of it. Right, so that's those edges done, and I'll probably trim a bit of this off. The less we've got that we have to maneuver, the better. So the idea is this is going to be stuck onto here, and I think once again, but this being so small, this building, that I think we'll just peel off the whole lot. Right, so we've just got to be careful with this side, because we've got our door cavities in here, and you certainly don't want to be pressing down and poking your finger through and tearing this label paper. Right, so that's the door steps in there, so it just wraps over the bottom edge there. Now the next components we've got is our doors, which I pre-made up. So what I did with these doors is they're just 1.4mm case board. They've been painted in the same reddish brown paint, and then I shoved it through the laser cutter to cut them out, and also to actually laser engrave the actual grooves in the door panel itself. So we're just going to use a little bit of rocket card glue for these doors, and we don't really need a great deal. To stick these on. And then we've got these tiny wee door frames, and I did several versions of these door frames, and basically cutting it down, laser cutting it down to the thinnest I could possibly do without it just completely falling to bits. Now this is also out of the case board as well, but yeah, they're just absolutely microscopic, these, in terms of their thinness. So this is going to be probably a bit of a challenge too, is getting a bit of glue in here. Now there's a little bit of glue seepage here, and of course that will be glossy, clear but glossy when it dries, but once I've actually gone over this with a matte spray varnish, they'll soon disappear. So it's starting to take shape now, and just that subtle bit of door frame there. So these doors are probably a little bit more recessed back than on the actual building itself, but I thought that it's probably best to sort of try and accentuate this a little bit in terms of the model form. So our roof sections can go on. So this is going to be butted up to these top edges here. we go, the first building mostly complete. So there's still some bits and pieces to do. There's the quite ornate ridging that goes across the roof, so that's one thing I still need to work out, and how best to do that. Obviously laser cut, but I've just got to sort of figure that out. So I think the construction and assembly of this wee building has gone reasonably well. There's certainly not been any major hiccups or glitches in terms of its assembly. Now, one of the things that you're probably wondering is, what about the roof? What happened there? And what I've actually done is I have actually filmed that component, but this video has actually become really quite long. So what I've done is I've broken that out, and that will be a separate video, because one of the aspects to generating the roof tiles that you can see here is a little bit of an experiment. So I did a little bit of experimental, developmental type of modeling there in order to create the effect that you see, and I'm actually really happy with how it's turned out. So that really in a way deserves its own video, and also obviously a separate video about the colours as well, GWR and Barry Railway colours, and actually a little bit of a discussion I think really about some of the other colours as well, that I guess the timber features of the building were painted at various points in this, possibly even different paint colours that were applied after it no longer was a functioning railway building. Yeah, so I think the outcome of this is pretty favourable, and I think in terms of the technique and the print and so forth, I think I'm confident enough now to get on to the next building, of course, which will be the Platform 2 building. A little bit more complex, obviously, because we're going to have windows in it, so that's the next step up, and there's going to be some, I think, a little bit of further investigation and devising a system for the windows and the window frames and so forth, so it's got a little bit more depth and a little bit more detail in it compared to what I've done in the past. So there we have it for today's episode, and as I mentioned, there's going to be 2 further videos that are going to follow on from this, and I think the first one will be about the slate tiles, the roof, and how I arrived at the effect that I've managed to achieve with the tile roof, and then of course there'll be a video all about colours. So I certainly hope you found today's episode interesting and gathered some ideas and inspiration for your own layouts. So do take care, look after yourselves, of course don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.